In a trench at East Smithfield, the wet earth smells cold and metallic, and the bones lie there in a silence that feels almost physical. This is where the Black Death pandemic of 1347 leaves one of its clearest traces. Not in a legend, but in the ground. What looks like a burial site is really a record. Later, bioarchaeologists will read the victims' bones and see that the dead were not taken evenly. Some bodies were more vulnerable than others. That matters because it tells us this was never just random ruin. The disease itself did not travel like a storm cloud. It moved along trade routes, carried by fleas living in grain and cargo. That means the real story is not only fear and death, but movement, storage, loading, unloading, the quiet machinery of commerce. And there is a deeper trail still. A study in 2022 found Yersinia pestis in graves at Kara-Djigach near Lake Issyk-Kul, close to its genetic root. So the question is no longer where the legend began. It is how a bacterium from buried earth became a disaster that swallowed Europe. If you want the next part, subscribe and stay with me. That root matters because the plague did not stay buried. Once Yersinia pestis found its way into moving goods, the real danger was no longer one grave or one village. It was the trade route cascade. Grain sacks, cloth bales, cargo holds, and the fleas hiding inside them did the quiet work. The disease did not need a legend. It needed storage, loading, and routes that never really stopped. So the Black Death spread the way it did, as a chain of hands opening doors, hoisting bundles, and sending ships back out again. By the time anyone understood the shape of it, the grain trade aftermath was already in motion. And that makes the burial pits near London feel even colder. East Smithfield is not just a graveyard. It is a place where the dead were later measured for what the plague took first and what it spared last. That pattern is still there, inside the bones. So the next question is not whether it spread, it is how fast, and why some places seem to collapse all at once, while others held on a little longer. So the pattern starts to make sense. The Black Death pandemic of 1347 does not need a dramatic hand throwing anything over a wall. It only needs a ship, a hold packed tight with grain and cargo, and the fleas already living inside it. Once that load moves, the infection moves with it, quietly, almost invisibly. At the dock, a man opens a sack and a fine dust lifts into the light. Another hand ties the bundle shut again. The work goes on. That makes the trade route cascade dangerous. Nothing in the moment looks strange enough to stop it. And so, the legend was powerful. A single violent scene is easy to remember. A long chain of loading, sailing, unloading, and reselling is harder. But the chain is what the disease used. Before anyone in one port understands what has arrived, the same thing is already leaving for the next. So the grave at Kara-Djigach matters. It pushes the story back before the famous panic, back toward the source of the outbreak itself, not just its spread. The ground there is old, but the trail it left is still moving. And in the ports, the first deaths are about to stop looking local. The graves at Kara-Djigach change the whole frame. In the soil near Lake Issyk-Kul, the dead from 1338 and 1339 sit earlier than the panic people usually picture. A 2022 Nature study found Yersinia pestis there, close to the bacterium's genetic root. So the story is not starting with a siege or a single ruined port. It is starting in a cemetery, with bones, and with a trail that is older than the legend. And that trail matters because it makes the Black Death look less like a burst of fate and more like a long, moving chain. The plague was already present on the road before Europe knew its name. When the disease reaches the western ports, the mechanism is already built into grain, cargo, and the people paid to move them. That is the uncomfortable part. The illness did not wait for permission. It rode with ordinary work. So now the question changes. If the source was already there and the route was already open, then what turned this into a catastrophe big enough to empty cities and fill mass burial pits? By the time the ports start counting their dead, the pattern is already larger than any one harbor. Hannah Barker's reading of the records points away from a single dramatic act and toward a wider system. Grain ships, cargo holds, port labor, storage rooms. That is where the Black Death pandemic of 1347 kept moving. In ordinary loading and unloading. In the grain trade aftermath of a market that never really stopped. That is what makes the myth so tempting and so misleading. One thrown body gives people a scene they can remember, but the disease does not need a scene. It only needs the next sack, the next deck, the next dockside hand. And once that trade route cascade is underway, the first deaths in a city can look local, even when they are not. A fever in one quarter, a burial in another, a ship in the harbor. By then, the place is already sharing the same problem with the next port. That is why the old legend survives. It simplifies what was actually happening into one visible moment. But the real danger is already spreading in the background, and the next harbor has no idea it is about to open its doors. And this is where the famous image steps in. Gabriele de Musi, an Italian notary writing far from the siege itself, leaves behind the scene people remember. Bodies hurled over a wall, plague turned into a weapon, one terrible act with one clear villain. It is vivid. It sticks in the mind. For centuries, that picture has been stronger than the slower evidence. But Hannah Barker's work pulls the camera back. Her point is not that the story is impossible in every detail. It is that the mechanism of the outbreak does not depend on it. The disease already has something better than drama. It has routes, cargo, labor, and time. That difference matters. A legend gives the mind a target. A system gives it none. One can be blamed on an enemy. The other grows out of ordinary exchange, out of holds that smell of rope, damp wood, and grain dust, out of ships arriving in one harbor while another is already preparing to sail. So the old siege remains memorable, and the real engine remains harder to look at. Because once the plague enters the ports that feed the Mediterranean, the story stops being about one wall and starts becoming a map. So the map starts to fill in, port by port. The Black Death pandemic of 1347 does not arrive as one single wave. It moves through the same places that keep food, cloth, rope, and pay moving. So the trade route cascade matters so much. A dock worker lifts a sack, dust rises, and nobody sees the flea. The ship leaves anyway. Hannah Barker's point is simple and grim. Once the routes are open again, the disease can travel faster than warning. The harbor hears about it from the previous harbor, but the delay is never enough. When the first sick bodies are laid out, another crew is already touching the same cargo. So the legend feels too neat. It gives us a single event to fear. The real spread is quieter and harder to interrupt. It is in the rope burn on a sailor's hand, the smell of grain in a warehouse, the wet wood underfoot at dawn. And somewhere ahead, in the next city waiting for those same ships, the first death is still just a rumor. Until it isn't. And once it becomes a map, the speed of it is what starts to feel unreal. The disease reaches one port, then another. Messina, Marseille, Genoa, Venice, Florence, Paris, London. Not as isolated tragedies, but as linked points in the same moving chain. Each place hears rumors first. A ship came in. Men were sick on board. Someone died fast. Then the smell of closed rooms, sweat, smoke, and damp cloth begins to settle over the streets. Within roughly 7 years, this outbreak will kill an estimated 40 to 60% of Europe's population, tens of millions of people. But inside each city, that scale is invisible at first. It begins as a handful of burials, a house gone quiet, a market stall left unopened. That is part of what makes the Black Death pandemic of 1347 so hard to grasp in real time. No one sees the continent. They only see the next body, the next family, the next lane where doors stay shut. And still, the mechanism keeps outrunning the fear. Cargo moves, grain moves, fleas move with it. The warning always arrives a little too late. Soon, the question in these cities shifts from where it came from, it is what exactly is happening to the body. By now, the body is telling its own story. A fever settles in, then the swellings come, and in some cases, the lungs take over fast. Guy de Chauliac, the French physician at Avignon, is watching this in 1348 from inside the papal court. And his notes matter because they show a doctor trying to sort the disease into forms instead of treating it as one blur. That is a small but crucial shift. The Black Death pandemic of 1347 is no longer just a rumor moving through ports. It has a clinical shape. That shape terrifies people more than the myth, because it means the problem can enter a room, sit beside a bed, and change everything in days. And the city response is still blind in the ways that matter. Fires burn, windows stay shut. People try to clean the air and drive away what they cannot see. But the illness keeps coming through the same openings, the same hands, the same packed houses. So the question deepens. If the body can be read this clearly now, why does the cure still fail? What they are missing is still sitting in the cargo, waiting for the next stop. At Avignon, the fires keep burning, but the point of the fire is not comfort. It is theory. Guy de Chauliac is still trying to read the plague as bad air. And that matters because the wrong idea still changes real behavior. Closed rooms, sealed windows, people retreating deeper into fear. What he cannot see is lower down, in the grain trade aftermath, in the sacks and holds, in the cargo that keeps changing hands. Yersinia pestis does not care about the argument in the doctor's head. It only needs the next bundle, the next dock, the next city, already waiting on the trade chain. So the city keeps burning, and the people keep hoping the smoke will save them. But the smoke is not touching the thing that matters most. The same ships are still moving. The same goods are still moving. And somewhere ahead, the record stops sounding like medicine and starts reading like a count. One body after another, headed for the mass burial pits. And once the body becomes evidence, the ground starts speaking more clearly than the chronicles. At East Smithfield, the buried do not look uniform. That is the unsettling part. The plague did not strike a flat field of identical lives. It left patterns behind in the bones, and those patterns suggest that weakness mattered. Some bodies had already been strained before the Black Death pandemic of 1347 reached them. Age, hunger, long wear, all of it written where the eye can still find it. Guy de Chauliac can name forms. Pope Clement VI can sit between fires. Gabriele de' Mussi can give the outbreak a dramatic scene. But none of them can see this part of the story from London's pits. The dead are not random. and the silence in the trench is doing statistical work. So the burial ground matters so much. It turns panic into something measurable. It turns the plague from a terror people talked about into a system that can be read, layer by layer, in the dirt. And if the dead were being sorted before anyone understood why, then the next question is not about death at all. It is about who exactly was always standing closest to it. At East Smithfield, the trench stops being only a burial place and starts behaving like a record. The bones there do not all carry the same marks. That is the hard part to sit with. Some bodies show more strain before the plague ever reached them. And that means the Black Death pandemic of 1347 was not moving across London like blank chance. It was hitting people already carrying more weight in their lives. That turns the mass burial pits into something colder than a graveyard. They become evidence that vulnerability mattered, even in the middle of panic. The city could not see that in real time. It only saw carts, shovels, and the next layer of dead. So the question changes again: how the disease spread and why it took some bodies faster than others and left a pattern behind for people in another century to read. And one of those patterns is about to lead away from London entirely, back toward the places where the trail first starts to move. And that closeness to death does not stay biological for long. It becomes social. When people cannot see the mechanism, they start looking for a face. The plague is still moving through cargo and contact, still following the same routes that carried goods, but fear begins traveling beside it. Close enough, maybe. This is one of the cruelest turns in the story. A disease with a real path produces imagined culprits instead. The same cities struggling with burial, smoke, and fever now struggle with rumor. And rumor has its own geography. It moves from street to street, from sermon to market, from whisper to certainty. That matters because the Black Death pandemic of 1347 is no longer only emptying rooms and filling graves. It is changing how people look at one another. The body is still failing in the same brutal ways Guy de Chauliac tried to describe. But the society around that body is beginning to fail too. So by the time the carts roll and the shovels bite deeper into the ground, something else has entered the city with the plague. Not Yersinia pestis this time, but the need to blame. And that second contagion is about to leave its own scar. So the dead at East Smithfield start to do something the living could not do in time. They force the pattern into the open. The burial pits are not random holes. They sit inside a logic of crowding, hurry, and loss that mirrors the whole city. That makes them matter to the story of the Black Death pandemic of 1347. The same ground that held the hurried dead later lets historians and bioarchaeologists see who was hit first and how hard. And that makes the silence sharper, not softer. Because once the body is read as evidence, the plague is more than death. It is about structure, who was exposed, who was already weakened, and why the damage spread the way it did. That kind of reading changes the catastrophe from a blur into a shape. And if it has a shape, then it can be traced backward, farther than London, farther than Avignon, all the way to the places where the trail first begins to speak. That trail does not end in the archives. Yersinia pestis is still here, moving through living ecologies long after the medieval burials have settled. The old catastrophe is gone, but the organism is not. It keeps a foothold in the world in a way that makes the story feel unfinished, like the ground at East Smithfield never quite closed. The modern reminder came in Madagascar in 2017, when the outbreak reached about 2,400 cases and roughly 200 deaths. That is not the Middle Ages replayed. It is something smaller, faster to contain, and still serious enough to show how quickly the old pattern can wake up again when conditions line up. So the documentary stops being only about what happened in London or Avignon. It becomes about what still lives in the background, waiting in reservoirs, waiting in movement, waiting for the wrong kind of season. The plague never became a museum piece, and that is the part history keeps trying to warn us about. So the story does not close with the medieval graves. Yersinia pestis is still part of the world's living background, which is what makes the old history feel so uneasy. The pandemic is gone, but the organism remains in circulation, away from the candlelight and the chronicles, waiting inside a much older ecology than any one city can see. The modern outbreak in Madagascar matters so much. It is not a copy of the 14th century, and it does not need to be. It is enough that the same name can still belong to a real, active danger, one that moves when conditions let it, and one that reminds you how little distance there really is between the archive and the present. And that leaves the Black Death pandemic of 1347 with one last hard lesson. The past is not sealed off just because we can date it. The warning is still alive in the organism itself. And the next question is where exactly it will be noticed first. So the old root does not stay old. The Black Death pandemic of 1347 keeps pointing forward because the organism never leaves the world. Yersinia pestis is still there, and that means the story is not locked in 1347 or Avignon or East Smithfield. It stretches into places where the ground is quieter and the warning signs are easier to miss. So the modern outbreak in Madagascar sits beside the medieval archive instead of below it. The numbers are smaller, the setting is different, but the feeling is the same one that runs through the older record. A living thing moving where people are already moving, turning ordinary contact into risk. One path is written in bones, the other appears in cases and deaths. And the two records meet in the same uneasy place. A trench in London, a cemetery near Lake Issyk-Kul, a port city with closed doors, a modern outbreak on an island in the Indian Ocean. All of them say the same thing in different ways. The plague was never only history. The last question is whether the next warning will come from a grave or from the living world first. In the end, the clearest answer is also the least theatrical. The Black Death pandemic of 1347 wasn't waiting for one perfect crime, one wall, one villain, one moment that could explain everything. It moved because a connected world kept moving. Grain, cargo, labor, hunger, crowding, distance, delay, all the plain things that make a society work also gave the disease its road. That is what the bones at East Smithfield, the graves near Lake Issyk-Kul, the notes of Kara-Djigach, the story preserved by Gabriele de Musi, and the later work of Hannah Barker all force into view. The myth survives because it is easy to picture. The mechanism survives because it is real. And the real thing is colder. A man lifts a sack. A ship leaves a harbor. A trench is opened in wet ground. Centuries later, someone brushes dirt from a rib and finds a pattern still waiting there. That may be the hardest image in the whole story. Not the dying city, not the ship, not even the grave, but the small, ordinary motion that keeps passing danger from one hand to the next. Then the trench goes quiet again. The soil settles back around the dead, and somewhere far from London, the bacterium remains alive in the dark.